In this video, I'm going to share some writing advice from some of the world's most famous authors, from those who have actually been there and done it. Don't forget to like and subscribe.
The best way you're going to learn about screenwriting, about writing for television, about writing plays, is by watching movies, watching television, watching plays, and mostly reading screenplays, reading teleplays, reading plays. Pick your favorite movies. Pick your favorite 5 movies. Find the screenplays for those movies. Sit and watch the movie with the screenplay on your lap. See exactly how what's there on the screen, what it looked like when it was on the page. People who love cars, they take apart cars. They started by opening the hood of a car, getting underneath a car, and just taking everything apart and laying it on the floor. Do that.
I had internalized this idea and said, look, I can't worry about this movie getting made. I have to write my favorite movie that doesn't exist. And so that put me on this path of working on this. And it wasn't like I was every night, I was like, no, for 5 years. It was, I allowed it to be my hobby. I allowed it to be the project that I would go to instead of watching television. That would be the most fun thing I could do with my time. And the whole purpose of it was to help me get better as a writer.
I was almost a historian. I've seriously considered being a historian. And while I was in the throes of this decision, I came on the idea that leaders amplify the mistakes. Their mistakes are amplified by the numbers who follow them without question. And charismatic leaders tend to build up followings, power structures. And those power structures tend to be taken over by people who are corruptible. I don't think that the old saw about power corrupting and absolute power corrupting absolutely is accurate. I think power attracts the corruptible. Dune is conceived of as a planet that is totally desert, so that water on it is the metaphor of, say, oil here, very appropriate at the moment. It is a metaphor of clean air, metaphor of water itself, potable water. And it's a metaphor for the shortages that we are encountering because of overpopulation. And the story is told in terms of people who are recognizable. You'd recognize these people, but they live in a culture that is somewhat different.
You see, I put it all down to the fact that I never had any education. Perhaps I'd better qualify that by admitting I did eventually go to school in Paris when I was 16, or thereabouts. But until then, apart from being taught a little arithmetic, I'd had no lessons to speak of at all. Although I was gloriously idle, in those days children had to do a good many things for themselves. They made their own dolls' furniture, and they made Christmas presents to give to their friends. Nowadays they're just given money and told to buy their presents in a big store. But I found myself making up stories and acting the different parts, and there's nothing like boredom to make you write. So by the time I was 16 or 17, I'd written quite a number of short stories and one long, dreary novel. By the time I was 21, I'd finished the first book of mine ever to be published, The Mysterious Affair at Styles. I'd sent it to 1 or 2 publishers who didn't want it, and eventually it went to John Lane. About a year later, I heard it had been accepted. Well, that's how it began, and since that time, I've written something like 55 books and half a dozen plays. I do find that one's friends are curious about the way one works. What is your method, they want to know. Well, the disappointing truth is that I haven't much method. I type my own drafts on an ancient but faithful machine I've owned for years, and I find a dictaphone useful for short stories or for recasting an act of a play, but not for the more complicated business of working out a novel. No, I think the real work is done in thinking out the development of your story and worrying about it until it comes right. That may take quite a while. Then when you've got all your materials together, as it were, all that remains is to try to find time to write the thing. 3 months seems to me quite a reasonable time to complete a book, if one can get right down to it. On the other hand, plays, I think, are better written quickly. And of course, writing plays is much more fun than writing books. You haven't got to bother about long descriptions of places and people, or about deciding how to space out your material. And you must write pretty fast, keep in the mood, and to keep the talk flowing naturally. I prefer to write a play as a play, that is, rather than to adapt a book. The only reason I ever did that was because I didn't care very much for what happened when other people tried to turn my books into plays. So, in the end, I had to do it myself.
You catch ideas, and a script is pretty important, but it's not, it's an organization of ideas, and many things are worked out in the script form, but like they say, it's a blueprint for a house. It's the house is the goal, and blueprint can be a nice thing, but it isn't the house. The same way with the script, it's not the film. So, but it helps you find the structure and organize things to a certain degree, and it goes always bit by bit. It just doesn't, you don't see the whole thing at once, and the way it unfolds is anybody's guess. It's kind of a magical thing, but eventually it gets there.
Well, structure to me is compare it with building a house. You have to have a base where the house is going to stand. You have to have walls. You have to have pillars that are going to hold it up. The staircase, the second story, or whatever. It is a kind of a mixture. Writing a movie is a mixture of architecture and, forgive me the pompous word, poetry. But it has to have a very solid thing so that the second act follows the first act. And it's strong enough to keep the audience in the seats to see the third act, what is happening there. But you need that very, very, very strongly. It's not that I make myself a drawing and a blueprint. It's just kind of an instinctive thing.
I didn't start writing when I was 40. I had been writing ever since I was 7. I suppose you can say I've been effectively writing since I was 35. I published my first book, or had my first book published, a book of verse, when I was 19. I'll say very little more about that. I just want to forget that one. Nobody knows anything about it. And then out of the rest, you've got to take 5 years for the war in the Navy, and 10 years perhaps learning to write by imitating other people, and learning very late that, of course, I was merely writing other people's novels instead of my own. And it wasn't until I was 37, I suppose, that I grasped the great truth that you've got to write your own books and nobody else's. Then everything followed from that.
There's a thing you can teach, and then there's a thing you can't teach.
So what are they?
What you can teach is craft. That a lot of writers can be taught how to do it better.
Right.
And how to make your sentences sharper.
What is that, making the sentences sharper?
Yeah, paying attention to form, making sure that the shape of the book tells the story.
The command of language, all that.
Yeah, no, the things I think you can't teach is that I think everybody who's a really exceptional writer has some very personal relationship with the English language. If you think about Hemingway or Joyce, or etc., you immediately know that it's Hemingway or Joyce when you pick up a page, and
do you see it in conversation?
Not always. No, I don't believe Hemingway spoke like that.
I don't either. That's my point. Yeah.
I don't think he did. But I think there's a thing. Certainly for me, I know that when I'm sitting down to write, my mind works in a way that it doesn't otherwise work. The kind of noises that come out of my head and onto the page, just in the act of writing, are different. I don't write in the way that I'm talking to you. Another thing happens, and I think that's the kind of magic thing. And I think that if you've got some interest, like Raymond Carver, anybody you can think of, has very particular relationship with the language. And the other thing is, I think what you said earlier, the thing is very hard to teach is the ear.
Can you teach the writing of fiction? Well, undoubtedly you can, because people do it. And you can even become a professor of creative writing, have a chair in creative writing. And you can get, get places to get a PhD in creative writing, I have no doubt. But I wonder what they're teaching. They're teaching me what must be the things you can talk about, the aspects of the craft that you can take out and examine and they sort of abstract and then put together again. And they're not always the most interesting or the most important aspects of it, I don't think. I'm always interested in courses of creative writing, but I regard them with a certain degree of faint suspicion. I'm actually associated with one. Oxford Brookes University do a course of creative writing, and I'm listed as one of the external lecturers or something, so I go in every year and give them a talk on this or that. But I think it's now that's a very good question, because you've made me think, what would I do now if I were a young aspiring writer? I'd probably try and get a place on a course for creative writing, and I'd probably get a place, and I'd probably do it and enjoy it. But those things didn't exist 45 years ago when I was young. There were nowhere where you could go and learn creative writing or get a degree or a qualification in it or whatever. So I had to learn for myself. And I suspect that's not a bad way of doing it, because you're on your own with the books that you've read and the influences you've gathered and that you're conscious of from a variety of things, not only books but films, of course, and stage plays and comics and oral storytelling. And you learn what you can do as you're alone in the room with your pen and your paper or your computer, but with the tools of your trade. You learn what you learn the most important things when you're alone, and I don't think they can be talked about. Not really.
No, I did short stories. Actually, how I started, I was taking a course in college from a friend of mine who was teaching. She was teaching a science fiction course, and I was taking it as sort of like a gut course. So I thought, well, I've read all these books anyway. And at that time, I was working on an animated film and an animation course, and I wanted to spend all my time doing that. So I said, I'll take this SF course, and I won't attend the lectures. And I've already read the books, and I'll just slop through. And so I tried it that way, and then I went to her and said, "Listen, give me a break. I really, I don't have time to write a term paper for this. Just give me a pass." And she said, "Well, if you can't write a term paper, you have to write a story." I said, "Oh, okay." So I went home, and I think it took like 3 months to write this 12-page little story that I gave her, and she said, "Oh, that's okay, you should try to sell that." So I sent it somewhere, and I think I sold it for like $23 to this little pathetic little magazine that nobody ever saw. Not like an amateur magazine from Boston. And so I was really happy when I sold it, but then I the cars from the Pulitzer Prize didn't appear outside the door, and I got all, less than $24, and nobody ever read it. So I just sort of let it, said, "Oh no, writing's not for me." But about a year later, I did another one, which I sold. And then I started selling them to Omni. And Omni paid enough that at that point, I couldn't actually stop. Like I'd get like $1,500 or something for the story, and it was the most money I knew how to get at one time, at that time. So I just kept doing them. And I didn't think I was going to do a book. I thought I would eventually do a novel, but I thought I was like 6 years away from it. And a guy commissioned me to do Neuromancer, a man named Terry Card, who had a series going where he went around and hired people to do first novels. And he was like a talent scout. And he had done this once before in the 60s, and it turned up a lot of people who became quite well-established science fiction writers. I think Ursula Le Guin started with Terry's first series of these books. And so he said, "Here, I'll give you some money to start, and you write me a novel, and if it's any good, I'll give you some more money when you give it to me." And it's, come back a year later.